Hey everybody, before we get started, I just want to remind you this episode is brought to you by our patrons like Ahagao Comics, Qua, and Nestor Flores. If you like what we do and want to see us do more, consider supporting us on Patreon. You can get access to episodes early and lots of other goodies, and it would really help us out. Thanks for your support, everybody. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. And it's here. So, they finally released the Emerald Empire PDF. I bought it, like, right away, that night. I also got the GM kit. I was kind of waiting for that to get a little bundle together. I'm not going to talk about the GM kit today, though. So, here it is. I wanted to do a full review of Emerald Empire, at least in my format of reviewing things. You know, kind of break down the sections, give an overview, give a lot of my thoughts on it, because I have a lot of them, most of them positive. I'm going to ruin the review. If you just want to take your TLDR and leave, Emerald Empire is pretty good. But we'll spend the rest of this time talking about why, and I'll kind of walk through the sections and give some overview thoughts and stuff. And hopefully this won't last as long as some of my other projects. Though I do think my video essays and stuff do need to be that long. And I do want to say real quick that no matter how long this is, there is an audio version of this available for patrons for a incredibly modest sum, a mere $1. And that's not just, $1 for this episode, it's for our entire audio back catalog, in case you're curious about other stuff. Anyway, Emerald Empire, first sourcebook of the new 5th edition of the Legend of the Five Rings game by Fantasy Flight Games. Got some loaded credits. Subtitled, The Essential Guide to Rokugan. Oh, there's the watermark. I was like, is there a watermark? There's supposed to be a watermark on this, right? I don't see it. No, it's very tiny down there. It's got my name and my order number. Okay. Because, yes, I have the PDF. I just noticed it looking at the cover art. So, note to self, if I take screen grabs, make sure to ice that out. Expansion development designed by Tim Cox. Lots of additional development, editing, proofreading, all that stuff. Proofing, very good. Usually FFG has a lot of little copy errors. Other than one area that's not fixed in the PDF, so it might not even be an error. There is a questionable thing in some of the player questions, but other than that, everything seems fine. So, high-level thoughts. Summary. Emerald Empire is, like it says, the Essential Guide to Rokugan. It covers all, well, maybe not all, but at least all the general aspects of the physical landscape of Rokugan, and then the socio-political landscape that evolves from that, because that's how people work. You take geography, and then you put people in it, and you get something that's social science out of it. It's in, well, it says it's in 7 chapters, but I really would say that it's in 8 sections, because after working through the introduction, there's actually a couple of things here, and we'll kind of talk about the different sections in a little bit. But there's 8 sections. There's only 1 section is devoted to new player options. Most of it, in fact, I would say 90-ish% of the book is fluff. It's core text in the usual 2-column format, breaking down whatever subject it is in the various chapters, whatever elements there are of it. So, for example, the first chapter is called Strongholds, so that's castles, palaces, etc., whether it's going down from daily life to the physical structure of a castle to specific examples of castles like Kyuden Bayushi. All the while, there are also sidebars on a number of topics. There are lovely maps with annotations. I believe, in fact, that there is, 1 map per section? I'd have to double check. But there's a lot of beautiful maps in there, which are all labeled to kind of give you a good feel. And while they are specific ones, since we're talking about the castle chapter, the example map given is the Castle of Bright Dawn. But other than that, you can also use them as just a generic example of any old castle, because most castles kind of follow the general same theme. And they talk about that. Same way for lots of stuff. Rokugan's a very orderly place, as you will find out. And of course, there's also everybody's favorite, the marginalia. The little red and blue bars on the side. You will also see a lot of NPCs. Not general NPCs, but specific NPCs, which is really good. You can use them for non-specific things, but they also have, all kinds of little notes and things that are specific here. Some backgrounds, you can use all these kinds of things. And of course, like it says at the front, there are also these lovely adventure seeds, which are basically your 101 Babby's First creative writing. How do you write a plot? They have hook, rising action, climax. And they have basically a paragraph or so for each. And it gives you all you need to know to put a adventure in a campaign, to make an adventure to start a campaign, to do a one-shot, anything like that. And there's loads and loads of these. There's usually, 1 per example place? Yeah, that's what it looks like. And it's all just really, really good and useful. And then, yes, at the end, there are actually new mechanics. There are new rules for playing Imperial family members. There are a lot of new schools, both for Imperials and for some more exotic elements of, greater entities moving around in Rokugan. Very interesting. We'll talk about that more in detail when we get there. There's a slew of new advantages, which are kind of themed to a lot of the subjects covered in Emerald Empire, and there are also a boatload of new titles, which are very good because while they are all fairly generic, they really do give you a lot of encapsulation for what you can do with a title, which basically is you can make whatever kind of campaign you want. You have some kind of like softy, not doing anything courtier, like, well, honestly, Bayushi Manipulator is already halfway to being a Bushi anyway. You just need a katana and a little couple extra out-of-curriculum spends. But a better example is actually if you want to turn anybody into a traditional Iaijutsu duelist, pick up the Yojimbo title. It gives you special access to both Iaijutsu cuts, if I'm not mistaken. I will double-check since I'm obviously looking at the PDF while I do this because I'm not an idiot. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so it gives you access to special access to Warrior's Resolve, Iaijutsu cut, and both Iaijutsu cuts. But also a couple of helpful skills. So that's pretty cool to, give this as a generic, and almost all of them are just, obviously you won't jump to being a daimyo at the start of a campaign, but you could easily say, oh, I'm a Yojimbo, I'm a spy, I'm a priest, I'm a gunso, I'm a clan magistrate. I would not necessarily recommend that, but it's there. A lot like the classic, you're all Emerald Magistrates. If anything to be concerned about, there is some risk, and the book is very smart to caution you on this subject, which is some of the schools and other mechanical options are a little, if not stronger, more useful or more generalized. And all Imperial families obviously start with a higher status too, which can be unbalancing because of the way status works. So it's kind of like a cautionary tale to not necessarily let players just jump in and pick whatever, right? And there are a couple of specific examples we'll get to when I think we talk about the chapter in depth in a second. Well, not a second, because it's all the way at the end, but you know what I mean. Where we'll talk about some specific examples where your GM needs to really watch what's going on with these guys, all right? So yeah, that's the high level. Mostly it's fluff. If you've ever had a question about Rokugan, and trust me, I had plenty, because while I was passingly familiar with the setting and done a decent amount of, overview reading, I wasn't in depth on it until I got into 5th edition, because, well, one, I really like FFG and I like to support their products. I was not scared by custom dice. You hear that sound? That's my dice. So, I bought in because I want to reward FFG for producing stuff I like. And because I can't monetarily afford to support some of the stuff they do. RIP. Me, because I can't buy as much Legion as I want. Anyway, that's an entirely different discussion. So, 5th edition and kind of like the sale to FFG and FFG developing their own release, while without its ups and downs, was a perfect idea for me to jump in. The way they've presented fiction so far is super accessible, so I'm all caught up on that. I love the novella writing, which I've talked about before. By the way, when the Unicorn Clan novella comes out, expect a full-blown review. I actually seriously regret that I did not think to shoot reviews for Sword in the Spirits and Whispers of Shadow and Steel, right away to give my actual, review-type thoughts, because I don't think I could go back and do that. Especially Sword in the Spirits was just, for such a short title, it was very gripping and got me in to the universe right away. Which wraps around to Emerald Empire, because Emerald Empire is the same way. Not 100% of your questions will be answered, but you should get enough guidance and enough insight into the nature of Rokugan to be able to just jump right in and figure out whatever you need, whether it's you're making a character as a player, or whether you're a GM making a campaign, making NPCs, just adjudicating your day-to-day. If anything, the one risk is that it's too dense. There's way too much information in here for you to just be able to memorize all of it right away. But, give it a few reads, you'll have the ability to cover a few sections. So, before I go waxing too poetic and too long about the book as a whole, because I think I've covered all the high-level stuff, let's kind of break down the sections and talk about each of them real quick, so you know what you're getting into in detail, if you haven't already, or you just want to hear some thoughts on what I think about the individual sections. So the introduction, there's an introductory fiction, which is just a page, which is kind of neat. There's an outline of the whole book in the front. There's a map. The PDF maps are still a little low resolution to actually use, but I think that's because they're such high. They are really detailed and in depth, and it's hard to reproduce. I really hope FFG makes a standalone version, but their current trend seems to be to only label map nodes that are mentioned or important, which is a little bit of a shame. But hey, they're the ones running the show, so they decide their art direction. And honestly, if you cram the map with literally every label, it would take too long. But after that, in the intro, before you get into the first proper chapter, you have the kind of like 2-part sections, which are how we got here, basically. The history of Rokugan and the world in brief. So it mentions, the world being created, the 5 ancient races, Tengu Kitsu, Ningyo, Trolls, and Zukujin, by the way. And then it kind of talks about the whole thing with Amaterasu and Onotangu, the fall of the Kami, all that stuff, leading up to the foundation of the Empire with Hante, and the war against Fu Leng, the Day of Thunder, and then ultimately you get into what is called the 1,000 Years of Peace, which is not necessarily literally peaceful, but hey. And actually, it's important to note in this section, they even have footnotes about how history is recorded by people. So the Miya and the Akoma and the Kitsune and other people keeping records or writing formal histories are not necessarily including every little detail, okay? So there's some fudgeable areas here. But 1,000 Years of Peace is basically just the timeline in sections, talking about little things here and there, and various historical notes, front to back. Most of it's pretty vague, like, for example, the Battle of White Stag, where there was some kind of Gaijin betrayal, and the Empress was killed. That's only vaguely noted, and there's lots of other little things talking about various different aspects, talking about the Blood Sorcerers, the return of the Unicorn, the bringing back of opium, stuff like that. Current plot hooks like the Perfect Land Sect, etc., moving into the modern area as we start the fiction of the game, which is, what was the last date? Yeah, I believe the last given date is 11/23 by the Imperial calendar. And yeah, that's basically the front section. It's not very short. It's just, 20-ish pages? Yeah, it's 20 pages. Which is pretty cool. It gives me all the high-level timeline stuff I wanted anyway, and hopefully it does the same for any of you out there. And I kind of want to do an intro to Rokugan video to kind of like cover basics of here's what the great clans are, kind of what you're expected to do, some timeline stuff. But honestly, it really feels a bit redundant if you just read some high-level intro stuff in the books. So the first proper chapter is Strongholds of Power, which is all about castles and forts. On a high level, it talks about feudal governance in Rokugan, like lords rule from castles, what do lords do, how do the banners work, who is in a court. It has a lovely section where it's like notable figures within court, which lists a lot of examples and what their roles are. Artisan, senshals, aka Kado, Haramoto, the matchmakers, instructors, etc. It runs through daily life in a castle for several different casts, which is really useful if you're generating a character. This is really great to be like, what's my day-to-day like? Well, you can look at this, and it kind of covers all that stuff. It also, as I said in the earlier section, talks about the actual geography of castles, breaking down all the different areas you might find in one, and then it goes into the actual castles and castle towns. You might find some examples. So, there's Toshiranbo, which is very important right now. There's Kyuden Bayushi is mentioned. And also, one of the things that's very good about this, I love this about FFG in general, but this is very good for this type of thing, is with every physical location, there's in addition to the Adventure Seed sidebar, there's a little sidebar which is titled something clever. Like, I'm looking at Kyuden Bayushi right now. So this is titled Tales of the Scorpion, and it's just 2 to 4 bullet points of just plot hooks, rumors, whatever, fun stuff that you can think about that might be appropriate to the setting, that can give you some cool either bits and bobs just to add flavor to a universe or turn it into an actual story seed. For example, so the Bayushi one is Tales of the Scorpion. The first one is Bayushi's Labyrinth was designed at the dawn of the Empire by Caillou himself at Bayushi's request. The second one is that there's a network of tunnels that riddle the plateau beneath Kyuden Bayushi. These tunnels extend throughout the Scorpion Lands, links together all the clan strongholds in a secret network. That could be a cool one to work with. There's the third one, which is a mysterious glowing lake lies somewhere deep within the tunnels beneath Kyuden Bayushi. The spirit of Bayushi himself can sometimes be seen floating above the lake. And the last one is anyone who steals personal items from the Trader's Grove is cursed with ill fortune. By the way, the Trader's Grove gets a whole, a paragraph or so in the description, which is good considering that most of these are like 2-ish pages, 2.5 pages. And then lastly, there's also a very useful section called War and Diplomacy, which talks about how courts actually work, who attends court, what goes on, what are the practices there. There's marginalia about various different regional court practices that are pretty good. It talks about all the different like ups and downs and things you can do. Super informative. There's sidebars about private speech, which I thought was super interesting. So, for instance, a shoji screen is supposed to be private, but also a fan has a similar effect. If you cover your mouth with a fan and speak privately to someone, even if somebody else overhears it, they're not supposed to act on it because that means you were eavesdropping, which is not good. And they talk about various practices, exchanging hostages, exchanging gifts, marriages, and adoptions. One thing that's pretty important, I think, that the section, and actually what I mean is FFG in general has gone pretty big on how important adoption is, because that's actually a historical Japanese thing. And sometimes not even historical. That'll happen even in modern Japan in some, like big corporations and stuff. So, adoption being almost as good as, or if not better than actual birth lineage is pretty important and I think very useful. And then after diplomacy, obviously, there's a war section, which is pretty good, talking about the different organizations and stuff. It talks about several histories of wars, how the different clans treat war and stuff. Very good. The second chapter is Centers of Trade, which is all about, centers of population. It covers general urban life, talking about what the different castes do. Also, this is the first instance of a very useful thing where FFG in Sidebars or Marginalia talks a lot about your real life experience and how it works into your RPing. So it talks about the term eta, which is considered derogatory in a modern sense, in Japan anyway, because you're actually calling somebody out on their social caste. So, they kind of talk about how you're going to have to decide for yourself if you think it's a serious concern to, like, role-playing, considering that I'm sure most of us live in America or Europe playing this. And so you're not really necessarily implying any kind of weird baggage about it. It's not like a classist thing you're going for. But hey, you might decide you're not cool with that and you want to go on. There's also a couple sections when we get later to the areas talking about religious stuff where they explicitly mention, like, some of these are drawn from real, like, names or practices, or just general feelings are drawn from real life religious or spiritual practices. I know from statistics that most actual Japanese people don't necessarily identify as religious, but, it's still a cultural thing you're pulling from, so they mentioned that, like, when you're out and about, like, if you're in a public place, I don't know if there's lots of people playing L5R on, like, back tables of a gaming shop or something. If you do, let me know in the comments. That would be cool. But just, hey, be considerate to people around you. Don't freak anybody out. Don't insult anybody, that kind of stuff. Really, really great talk about all this stuff that I think is very, very good for just helping you grow as people, because you have to think about your real-life context and all that. So, Chapter 2, like I said, urban life, if you ever want to know what daily life is in, like, a city. I talk about the different castes. There's a whole page which is nothing but talking about food, which is great. That's always a question you probably get a lot, is like, hey, what do I eat? There's the actual context of what's the difference between, like, a city and a town kind of thing, right? Like, how are those differently in their sizes? What actually matters in here? Various segments of a city, like the anatomy. Not quite to, like, the detail of, like, all right, so a castle has explicitly this segment and that segment sort of thing. But this is, like, generally there's these kind of districts, these kind of sectors and areas. Talk about the architecture. Talks about the difference between towns and cities a little bit. Has a lot of examples of towns, including Otasan Uchi, the capital, which is that's got a pretty big segment. The City of Lies, Yoroko Owaritoshi, which is, another major point in talking about history of L5R. There are also some interesting things like Kanbulak is in there, which is one of the major unicorn cities. There's a Redhorn village, in case you ever need a village where you can go burn down the Kolat. I'll get this out of the way now, guys. I really don't like the Kolat for a couple reasons, but I think they're useful in terms of games, so I'm not against them existing. I am pro burning down their village, though. But anyway. They also talk about harbors, which is really good and useful. You might not necessarily have a lot of, seafaring going on, right? But when you do, it's good to know kind of, how those are different, how there are different types of ports for different industries, what's the difference between fishing, shipbuilding, military, trading. You can run into river harbors and river ports, which is very important. And it kind of talk about how their differences are between, certain thing. And it talks about a couple different places. City of the Rich Frog is in there. That's another really common thing. It's got some interesting ideas. And the last section in this area is Crime and Punishment, which, for me, first of all, that's just my personal jam. But that's really helpful to anybody running a campaign because it talks about clan magistrates. It talks about the people who work for magistrates. It talks about how you actually conduct a court and how you punish crimes, which is all super important for role-playing, especially if you're running that kind of campaign. What's your MO? What are your possible punishments and stuff? Very useful. Chapter 3 is called Heart of the Empire. It is about just the general logistics of people living. Mostly it's about farms and villages and stuff, but also it mentions other kinds of resources like fishing villages, mines, lumber, stuff like that. It talks about a lot of stuff that affects communities that are more rural, and lots of just about general, rural living. If you ever have to travel anywhere in Rokugan, this is a big deal, and to spoil it later, hey, guess what? There's the whole subsection at the end here is talking about roads and rivers and ways of travel, talking about areas about roads, travel times, travel passes, road stations, which has a map, a couple of different road examples, and that is very, I think, useful to any kind of campaign. If you are ever traveling, that's a huge deal, right? But also, it talks a lot about villagers and village peasants and how they work. Lots of stuff about interacting with the common people, whether that's, you got to crash at their house, you got to tax them, they're unruly, they have bandits attacking them and they need your help. All kinds of stuff. And talking about various things. Talks about a lot of the different crops you have in Rokugan, which is really useful. Very, very important. And breaks down lots of examples of villages and stuff like that. And also, talks about a lot about social interaction, too, which is very important for role-playing. So, the first half of the book is basically civilization, I would say. So, you've got Strongholds, Centers of Trade, Heart of the Empire, so that's castles and palaces, courtly stuff. That's big cities and towns, trade, mercantile aspects. And then you got villages, production areas, where people live and farm and cut down trees and fish and stuff. And then, so, chapter 4, 5, and 6 are a lot of more spiritual, metaphysical, natural stuff. So, chapter 4 is called Sacred Spaces. This is very important because it talks about, first, it talks about the cosmology of Rokugan, which is super important. That's something I was super interested in because it actually, that's high-level stuff that you really need to get into. So it talks about Tengoku, talks about Yomi, and kind of how the overworld, the heavens work. Talks about realms that are beside ours in modern-day Rokugan, like Chikushido, realm of animals, Sakaku, the realm of illusion, that kind of exist beside us. Lots of interesting plot hooks and discussion about Yumedo, the world of dreams. And it also talks about the underworld. It talks about Jigoku, and it talks about Meido, Gakugo, Toshigoku, all those kinds of stuff, and spooky, scary stuff going on that you probably want to know about if you're doing deep metaphysical stuff. Also talks about kind of how you handle the dead, worshiping your ancestors. You've got a section on Kami and fortunes, which is super important. It lists a lot of big fortunes. Though it does have kind of a confusion with Korra. This is another error here where, I think, is it pronounced Kishoten? She is not necessarily counted as one of the 8 great fortunes. Only 7 are listed. I know that in the past they have flipple-floppled. Like L5R has gone around about whether or not there are 7 or 8 great fortunes. I feel like they should have made that a little bit more explicit, like a margin note, because some people are confused. It also mentions, popular fortunes. It talks about the structure of a shrine both in a physical and metaphysical sense, the people who work at shrines, various religious practices, which are also pretty important, and religious prohibitions, what you should not actually do. There's a lovely sidebar about a handful of superstitions per clan, which is great. Talks about the kind of stuff that happens at shrines, weddings, etc. Festivals. Festivals are a big deal. It gives an example of some festivals, which are really cool. Like I said, it discusses the physical structure of a shrine, gives some example shrines, which are really interesting. Benten Seido, the Great Shrine of Benten, the Shrine of the Kirin. Talks also about dark shrines, whether shrines are corrupted or shrines to not necessarily positive fortunes. Like, it gives a couple fortunes that are kind of like suspicious and whatnot. Talks about if shrines are haunted, and some basics on forbidden rituals, which are interesting, and stuff like that. Mentions a Kodama, which is really cool. I really, really like Princess Mononoke. Chapter 5 is Paths to Enlightenment, which is all about... Well, first off, it's about the Tao of Shinsei, the little teacher. Like, it talks about how he is observed, Shinsei the philosopher, Shinsei the hero, Shinsei the god, stuff like that. Mentions lots of different things, like, the philosopher is you read the Tao and kind of study his teachings. The hero they mention a lot about the Thunder Dialogue, which is an alternate telling. It's kind of like full of fantastical and hyperbolic tales of Shinsei. And then there's talking about the Perfect Land Sect. They talk about the Brotherhood of Shinsei and the various monastic orders that you can run into, including some examples. How monasteries work and how Shinsei's temples function. And kind of, how they exist as an almost third estate. Which, if you don't know, talking about classical European, like, feudal makeup. The estates are like the nobles, the common people, and the clergy. And in the future, they have the idea of the fourth estate journalism. But they kind of function as like a socio-political entity separate from other castes. Also gives their daily life, which is really useful. Talking about the difference between temples and monasteries, and lots of different examples of them with hooks and all that other stuff. And then we move into the 6th chapter, which is the last fluff chapter, which is called Wilds of Rokugan, which is all about wild natural spaces. So it talks about the kind of resources you can find in different regions, coasts, forests, mountains, etc., ruins. Talks about how people live and work in nature in the wilderness. Kind of mentions the structure of all these places we mentioned. Talks about mountains, what kind of resources you can find in there, how to travel on mountains, what kind of hazards there are in mountains, a couple example, like mountain villages and areas. Talks about forests, like the Kitsune Forest and the Shinneman Forest. By the way, this is some of my single favorite writing in this entire book, as an example. On page 214, there's a marginalia sidebar, which is rules posted in a Shinneman logging hut. Because they talk about how there's this whole thing where people really need lumber, so occasionally they cut down the outskirts of the Shinneman Forest, which got to be very risky. So these include rules like, do not answer the door after dark, never forget to bring your talisman while you're out working, one of my personal favorites. If the eyeless girl stands by the window again, just throw salt at her. It's very casual writing. Never pet friendly animals in all caps. If a tree wasn't there yesterday, do not touch it. Do not eat wild fruits while in the forest, and there's a couple others. To me, this is a perfect microcosm of why this book is really good, right? Like, it's pure fluff. It's all just little details. It tells you so much in so little. Just the way we casually talk about the eyeless girl. Oh, she's just a ghost or whatever. Just throw salt at her. It's fine. But never pet friendly animals in the way it's presented in all caps. I don't know how that would come across in kanji, but it's really cool in the writing of the text. And it's just so good because it tells you so much. It tells you about how people live in Rokugan. It tells you about threats they face. It tells you how they handle these things, the interaction. It's really great. And also, the section talks about ruins, which is also really useful if you wanted to run that kind of stuff. And coasts. And so, as you can see, like I said, the first 3 chapters are very much like, rigid structures of your urban society. And then the last 3 are much more open and out there. They include shrines, which may be in villages or maybe stand on their own as temples. They can be all kinds of places, and they have this spiritual power, monasteries, and like or similar. And then all the actual wild places. And then Chapter 7 is new player options. So as I mentioned before, these are pretty good. There's a sidebar note about unusual schools. So, basically letting everybody know that, hey, you're going to be doing some different stuff if you pick some of these school and other options. So the Imperial families exist as new answers for the 20 questions game. Like I said, the core Imperial families, which replaces kind of your Great Clan selection, have status 40, which is, a whole kind of a thing. Puts them above. There's some really good schools in here, which are really interesting, but also kind of kitschy. Like, Cartographer's school ability is really good, but at the same time, if you're not running that sort of campaign, why are people playing a Mia Cartographer, right? So there's that sort of thing. There's personally, I find a little bit confusing about whether or not the ring bonuses for Sepun Palace Guard and Sepun Astrologer are correct. They seem kind of flip-flopped. So Palace Guards get Earth and Void, and Astrologers get Air and Water. I think those should be flipped, but there's no errata notes or anything, so maybe not. What's super interesting is that there are a couple of monk schools in here which are much more on point. They are actual, possibly peasant monks or retired samurai, as opposed to the Kaito, which are a monk tradition but are drawn from a samurai family, previously a vassal family, now an actual full-blown family. And the Togashi Order, which is also really weird because anybody who gets in there is given the family name Togashi and considered a samurai. So both of them are weird cases of the monk tag. But you have Fortunist monks who have special access to incantations and don't have Kiho. I think this furthers the point that you should kind of get it out of your head that Kiho is the monk thing. It can be a monk thing, and for the other monk school, Shinsei-est, it certainly is. But Fortunists get Kata Ritual Shuji, and then they have the special school ability to pick certain evocations based on the fortune they are dedicated to. So that's the thing. And then Shinsei-est is all about elemental teaching and stuff, and so Kiho. And then there's 2 special schools, which I kind of want to talk about a little bit. There's the Kitsune Impersonator tradition, not school, but tradition, which is, hey, you're a literal fox spirit or closely descended from one. You have magic powers, and this is one of 2 schools which gives you the disadvantage false identity. You're pretending to be somebody. You have really weird powers. You get to have Shugenja powers, even though you might be pretending to be a Bushi and have no access to kata. So personally, I would recommend make sure you impersonate a... Well, that's not entirely true. You have exclusive access to a couple of katas, but I would say make sure you impersonate a courtier maybe or a Shugenja, because you don't get the sociability to hide your invocations. But yeah, so that's obviously like a weird thing you do. You're playing a character with a false identity who is a supernatural creature, and if you become compromised, your disguise slips and you might pop a tail or ears. Your feet might get all foxy. Your shadow might turn into a fox kind of stuff. So that's like a whole tension thing, but that's kind of like super cool to me. And then what's not super cool is there's the Kolat School, which is for the Kolat Saboteur Conspiracy. I do like that with schools we are getting a little bit looser. Like monks are referred to as orders usually. Bushi, courtiers, and Shugenja are usually called school. But Kitsune is called a tradition. Kolat is called a conspiracy. I think that's pretty interesting to kind of like talk about. And Kolat is tagged as a shinobi school, so it's an infiltrator thing. Basically, you're playing a member of the conspiracy, a sleeper agent, ready to spring at any moment and kill people. You get some ninjutsu access. You get a very weird rank 1 to 5 ninjutsu, which is not marked as primo access. That's probably a typo also. At the very least, it should have the pip to let you know that it's exclusive because you don't normally get access to ninjutsu. You, in fact, only get katas and shuji, which, as much as like I said, I don't necessarily like the kolat. I don't like how people think of the kolat. Like, everybody's like, oh, the kolat are cool. No, they're not. But they don't get rituals because they don't believe in the supremacy of the kami and the ancient ancestors. So you don't get to make prayers to the fortunes and stuff and call on your sacred ancestors to purge stuff or block out thresholds or ask the spirits for help, which is really neat. Like, they go that extra detail. So obviously the Colette school is not really for everybody. The Kitsune school isn't either. I think because of their nature as like tricksters and kind of like, oh, I can just, I thought it would be funny. The Kitsune kind of can fit into any campaign if you're willing to deal with the consequences. The Colette school, especially with the shuji they can get in some of their other stuff, is you really need GM's approval, and as a GM, you need to know that this is going to come up in your campaign if you're going to integrate the Colette school. Hopefully, we are in a new age of RPGing where people kind of know their etiquette and stuff. You don't just roll up day one with a character sheet. You should hopefully talk to your GM first. You should have a session 0 to kind of hash out some campaign high level and stuff. So there's no, like, unfortunate things that go on, but there may or may not eventually be some rumors on the internet of people playing that guy, or that guy playing a Colot showing up all of a sudden and being like, I killed that guy. Mostly, honestly, this is one of those cases where I feel like a lot of the people who are prompted to play this kind of like, ooh, I'm going to be an edgy, revolutionary, hidden conspiracy guy, they're not really prepared for the whole running effectively a terrorist conspiracy sleeper cell. But I am, because I designed a campaign for Knights Black Agents with a conspirament. Pro tip, if you are going to do co-op stuff, you need a conspirament. And then after these schools, like I said, there's a lot of new advantages, which are super cool. A lot of them are themes to various aspects of this. Themes and stuff that go on here, like spiritual protector. You have a good spirit looking after you. You can be hero of a village. You can be a friend of the Brotherhood, which is pretty cool. Passions are really great here. You can have a passion for a specific city, passion for bonsai. You can be a gourmet. A couple of different stuff. Rock gardening is also in there. Those are really cool. Disadvantages also cover a lot of things. You can get a general allergy, which was something I came up with because I found out the Japanese have a term for hay fever, when I was like, oh, that needs to be a thing. It's not super common, but it could be. You can be adopted peasant. There's the inverse of hero of a city, despised in city. You can have a generic cursed lineage, which is pretty cool. You can have a couple stuff. Some people are kind of on the fence about whether or not skepticism is a cool disadvantage. That's the classic, you don't believe in the divinity of kami, the existence of spirits, veracity of celestial, blah, blah, blah. This constitutes a grave blasphemy kind of thing. I know some people are not necessarily, into that sort of thing, and I that is another one of those things that in the history of the game has been a point of contention about, it's super cheap to take I don't believe in supernatural stuff. Personally, though, I think especially with the design of this game, that sort of stuff's going to bite you in the ass. But anyway, there's new anxieties, which are really cool. Like, you can be accustomed to luxury. You can have a loathing for peasants. You can have claustrophobia if you want. Loneliness. There's only 2 new techniques in here. There's a new shuji for imperial families, which is basically you force them to shut up. You force them to silence. And then Colot have kind of a ability to take a minor or previously unknown NPC and turn them into a sleeper agent asset with you, which is a neat ability. But once again, I would remind everybody that's like, wow, you really need some GM input on that stuff. And then there's the titles, like I said. I can list them all out just so you know. There's Advisor, Clan Magistrate, Daimyo, Gunso, which is like a sergeant type. There's a Monastic Acolyte, there's a Priest, there's a Spy, there's a Yojimbo, and there's a Yodaki. Personally, like, some of that stuff, like Yodaki, like Yojimbo, even like Priest, arguably, because you could be a Shugenja assigned to, like, a specific Priest if you're running that type of game. A lot of these, maybe even Gunso, a lot of these could be, like, right away, instantly take. Spy could be also. And that's that. There's an index, and then it's over. So, that's kind of, your breakdown of all your sections. Hopefully I covered all the topics that you want to know about. I wanted to talk a little bit, so I'm of 2 minds. I want to talk more about all the individual sections of the things I like. Like, every little example, even if it's just a page, is so useful and so helpful. It's full of so much information you can use, whether it's to kind of like springboard into full-blown campaign hooks or just, tickle your fancy about what kinds of places can exist in Rokugan. From cities to castles to forests to shrines, all kinds of stuff. Like, what are the roads like? There's so much just day-to-day fluff detail, which is kind of essential, and I know some people were critical of the core book that it didn't necessarily have as much fluff as it could have, because it's very high level. There are a lot of game lines which are basically 2-book cores. I would say if you're like me, or like lots of other people who either haven't jumped into L5R before, or maybe it's been a while, or you're just, you're new to the setting or the system, Emerald Empire is absolutely an essential buy just because it gives you so much information, like I said. Like, I keep gushing. It's so full of stuff which is just so useful and thoughtful to you, and it's so interesting. The first day I got this, I just sat and read. I read about half the book, even though I think it was, like, in the evening or whatever when the news broke that it came out, and I got it. So, and then the next day I, like, read the rest of it. I've designed a couple example characters with some of the new stuff. Though it's a little clunky switching back and forth between PDFs. But anyway, it could be clunky, or I could be switching back and forth between physical, 300, 400-page hardcovers. Anyway, it's just so helpful. And if you aren't necessarily interested in paying the full, like, 40, 50-ish bucks for the hardcover, check out the PDF. If you just want a small portable thing, you can probably pop on any kind of device you have, pop on your computer, scroll through, read at your leisure. And it's just very helpful and useful, all right? It's helpful and useful just from getting to know the feel of the setting. It's helpful and useful for locations, like I said, for the many, many NPCs and plot hooks, right? These are fully statted NPCs, example abilities, lots of example templates. Very useful to you in kind of like, what you may be after. And I love the book a lot. It's all I wanted out of this book. Like I said, a great read, too, just top to bottom. And it has actual good advice in there, too, not just, ideas and examples and maybe not lessons is the right word, but, details about the setting that players and GMs need to know. But like I said, the margin notes and the sidebars are full of just, hey, here's not how to be a prick, and here's how to have a better game kind of stuff. Like, watch how you present some of these themes, be careful with, like, and sensitive to people's real-life concerns, because we are kind of, aping on a culture. I know some people have had some concerns about, like, some of the linguistic writing. Personally, I don't think, I'd love to ask some of them. And I could. Because our community approaches a couple topics, we've had some people who live in and around Japan. I could ask them some stuff. But I personally don't think the Japanese super mind, because I've watched some anime and I have seen what they do to other languages, so I don't mind. I don't think they mind if we borrow some words and some terms here and there, Or have you ever watched like an anime about European fantasy? How historically accurate is that, right? Like, FFG's L5R actually is a lot of strides in like being sensitive to the historical and cultural context, but also being like, hey, Rokugan's not really Japan. There are a lot of similarities that we borrowed for coolness, but also it's got similarities to several other Asian cultures, and it's got some of its own unique aspects, including the fact that the mythology is very lazily Greek, but whatever. Listen, it was, the mid-90s? It was a different time. Speaking of which, by the way, check out the podcast Garbage of the Five Rings if you want to know about some classic L5R stuff. The first couple episodes are a little negatively loaded, but at the same time, they also are like, they're looking at this from like a chronological basis, and it very much is kind of like a, wow, this was really sketchy and rushed up front. I think there was an article posted about the art direction of the early L5R recently too, which was the same, which was like, yeah, so we tried, but we also didn't have a lot of time, so, decisions were made. Like that infamous art of Yogo Asami in the hat that looks like a scorpion tail. Or is that also her hair? I don't know. It's real ugly. A regular Scorpion Clan disaster. Anyway. No need to pick a fight with old L5R stuff. Just, Emerald Empire is really good. If you are new to the RPG, or like I said, or it's been a while, it's definitely a must-buy at some point, just to get all your details. To be more feature complete with some of the schools, because you never know when you might need that monthly school, or you might need some ideas for Imperial stuff, Or maybe you want to run an Imperial campaign, I don't know. And just lots of general setting details, like I said. From top to bottom, it gives you the information you need at least to get started and be like, yeah, I know what daily life is like in a village. If you are either you're one of those nerds who's familiar with historical stuff in Japan and can kind of sketch out your own details based on other fluff, or you're a longtime fan of the setting, the book isn't necessarily a must-buy. It has new info in there. It has both FFG's alteration to the setting or kind of their distillation of some historical stuff and general inclusion. And it's useful to kind of understand the context they're going for this new Rokugan, and obviously there's mechanics in it and other stuff you may be interested in, but it's not as essential. But it's still really good. Like I said, I've said this, 3 or 4 times now. Just reading it's really good. I'm a huge fan of it. I didn't notice any, typos or other weird errors. There's just, maybe a couple formatting errors in the player section, which is generally how FFG rolls, unfortunately. The fluff stuff is all super useful and good to anybody at any time period running this game, or people just interested in this kind of setting. The mechanics, like I said, they can be there definitely needs a watchword on some of them, and some of them can be a little sketchily implemented, but they're still very interesting, and, as always, it's your game, your rules, so keep that in mind. So I talked about as long as I think I should about this. Hopefully this wasn't too boring and you got a good grasp of all the different sections, what I like about the book, some of the stuff I don't like, and so on and so forth. And, hey, if this influenced you to purchase it, or maybe to give it a pass if you're not interested in other things, whatever, I did my job. And hopefully it was an interesting discussion. I liked giving it, and, obviously we'll do the whole thing, give the video a like. That lets me know you enjoyed this and you give positive feedback and also helps the video circulate through algorithms and whatever. But, that stuff, and also comments in the comments section down below, or talking to me on our Discord, which is in the description. Yes, this is just my usual outro repurposed. Will give me feedback. I need to let me know, do you want me to tighten it up? Did I not need to talk in so much detail about each of the specific chapters? Whatever. And I'll keep that in mind for future books, because Shadowlands is coming out. And, I can cover that too. Like I said, I'm going to talk about the Unicorn novella when it comes out, because I'm hella buying that. And not much else is there to say here. Just, give some feedback, what you thought about this and your thoughts on the review. And I can kind of, get back to you, and I'll use it going forward as I do more of these. Also look out for some other L5R videos we've done. I did an example of character creation. I've done a couple, basically, video essays on how you do certain schools, like what their capabilities are and how you can use them best in certain ways, maybe what to avoid, how they kind of interact and what their fluff turns out to be. So check those out, and I will definitely do more. Not this week, though, because I basically shot the length of one of those videos on this thing, and my voice is starting to get a little dry. I also got other stuff to do. And look forward to other things we do on the channel. We also like to cover X-Wing and Star Wars Legion and lots of other topics and stuff. So keep an eye out. Anyway, the only other thing I have to say is if you are new here and haven't already, please subscribe so you always know when we get the next video out there. You can catch up with our various video series. Also, don't forget to hit that bell for notifications so you can always know when we post a video. And like it says at the front, and I mentioned in the intro, consider supporting us on Patreon. Really helps us out. Gives us the energy to keep going, gives us the fun to keep going in some places. And also gives you access to stuff like various integrations and whatnot. And also, like I said, for just $1 a month, you can get the audio version of this, just as a portable little thing you can take with you. And you get access to our entire back catalog, which includes those video essays and that character creation summary I talked about before. And I know I've been saying it for months, but eventually, I'm going to knuckle down and I'm going to run some L5R and record it and put it on the channel as actual plays. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, that is definitely something you want to get into our community for, because I wrote out a whole introductory scenario, and I've got a couple bites for it already. But I did make up to 7 pre-gens, so people didn't necessarily have to dive deep into character creation, so, I could run that a few different times, and we'll see. Alright, that's the video. I talked long enough. Hopefully editing shortens this down a little bit. And I will see you guys in the next video, whatever format that takes. As always, I say thank you for your time. It always deeply heartens me when people put up with listening to me for this long. And, everybody, stay cool, stay honorable, and enjoy your time in Rokugan.